All right. Welcome everyone to the Importance of Gender Pronouns workshop hosted by the Graduate College. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists who are here to share their expertise with us today. My name is Alyssa Gardner. I'm the Event and Program Manager at the Graduate College, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Okay, so please welcome our panelists today. We have Dr. Barb Brents, Professor of Sociology. We have Dr. Amanda Pasinski online with us, Assistant Faculty in Residence in Psychology. We have Dr. Annaliese Grant, Assistant Professor of Sociology, Torisha Khonach, Sociology PhD candidate, and Erin Rook, our Public Health M.P.H student. So before we officially begin, I just want to provide a little bit of background information for today's workshop. So it originated from what is called Senate Bill 109. So the summary of Senate Bill 109 states, an act relating to governmental agencies requiring governmental agencies to request from certain persons information related to sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, providing, with certain exceptions, that such information is confidential, requiring a governmental agency to annually report certain information related to sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. So with the adoption of Senate Bill 109, the state of Nevada has declared that it is in the best interest of the state to respect, embrace, and understand the full diversity of residents by collecting accurate information to effectively implement and deliver critical services and programs. So in line with that legislation here at UNLV, students are able to update demographic information, including gender identity, sexual orientation, and pronouns via My UNLV. So today we are going to discuss different aspects of gender identity, why it's important to understand and use gender pronouns correctly, and how we can work together as a UNLV community to support an environment of belonging and inclusivity. So let's begin the conversation. I'm going to start out with a question for our panelists. Would you please just each share a brief introduction, including your specific field or research, any background that you would like to share about how your work relates to today's topic? So if you want to go ahead and turn on the microphones, and let's start with Dr. Brents.
Hi everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm Barb Brents. I'm a professor in the sociology department at UNLV, and I've been here for about 36 years teaching gender and sexuality classes at the undergrad and grad level. My research has most recently turned to the sex industry and sex work and understanding how sexual minorities are treated and politicized in this country in a lot of ways. And I think that's relevant to somewhat to what we're talking about today.
Hi, I'm Torisha Khonach. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology, and my dissertation research focuses on reproductive justice and the body and embodiment of parents. And so I do bring into account, acknowledgement of like queer and transgender parents. I've also in the past done research on sports and so my research was on specifically the sport of roller derby, which is one of the most inclusive sports when it comes to folks who are trans and being able to participate in both women's and men's teams. So that's just some research background. And I've, of course, also volunteered with the LGBTQ Center of Southern Nevada, and I was heavily involved in the Pride organization from where I'm from.
Hi, I'm Annaliese Grant. I use she or they pronouns, and I am this is my first year assistant professor in sociology, and my research broadly covers gendered and classed dynamics in care work and media use among families in the United States. But I teach sociology of gender and have spent a bunch of time thinking about how to make the most inclusive learning spaces, especially for diverse gender expression and identity students.
Thanks. I'm Erin Rook. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I'm kind of quiet, so I'll try to keep this close to my face. I am a master's in public health student, aspiring PhD candidate, I suppose, and My research interests primarily focus on transgender health, specifically the impact of community connectedness on mental health, suicide prevention, things like that. But before coming into the public health field, I guess I also manage a trans health equity project in Oregon called Gender Hive, but previously have spent a lot of time training and having conversations about gender, so enjoy that and have done work as a journalist on that topic as well.
Thank you all. Dr. Pasinski?
Hello, I'm Dr. Amanda Pasinski. I use they, them pronouns. I am a assistant faculty in residence at the psychology department. This means that I'm more teaching intensive than research focused. A lot of my courses are very, very broad, but all of them include discussions of intersectionality when it comes to race, ethnicity, gender, sex, socioeconomic status. I'm also a member of the psychology department's ideas committee, which is our inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and solutions committee. So spend a lot of time working on making courses more inclusive, as well as trying to do this sort of at a department level as well.
All right, thank you all so much for being here again. So let's dive in. My first question for the panel, and anyone who would like to respond can jump in. Would you please provide an overview of the gender binary? Why and how should gender pronouns be used, and why are they important?
I guess I'll jump in first and try not to give a 50-minute lecture on this. But first, I want to say I use she, her pronouns, and I think I might represent the stuck in their old ways kind of person who is trying to change. And normally I wouldn't even call out the fact that I ignored that, because really the best way when you misgender or make a mistake is just to change it and move on. But I figured I'd be the see what it's okay and move on person. But gender, just to real quickly try to go over, gender is a big deal in our culture, but it's also kind of nothing in reality. And let me explain what I mean. Gender is, it's a big deal because when somebody's pregnant, the first thing you do is say is a boy or girl. And so it's almost how we attribute humanness to somebody. And it goes on from there, imbued in all sorts of institutions, and has a huge impact on how we go through our day-to-day lives. The other thing is gender binary. We have either boy or girl, either man or woman, and nothing in between. Or very difficult to conceptualize that is in between. The thing that we recognize pretty quickly is how much of gender is socially constructed, which means that it's a category that human beings collectively have made up to help make sense of the world. What that means socially constructed is not necessarily that's any less real for any particular culture, but it's changed historically over time. I mean, I would argue that really it was in the 12th century that we started being obsessed with gender binary in the way that we are today. Before that, yeah, different roles mattered, but they didn't get assigned to gender boy, girl in the same way that we do almost obsessively today. They change across cultures. You can't almost find a non-Western culture where there's not a third gender or some way of balancing gender or being both at the same time or being many at the same time. So it changes historically. It changes across a person's lifetime. When I was an adolescent, certain gender performances were more important for me to fit into my peer group than they are today. So gender really changes, but our culture still provides a lot of things that demand that we think in a different way. And I would also argue that biologically, really, when we look at gender characteristics across the men and women, you're grad students and professors, you know what the normal curve is. In just about any trait or characteristic you can look at, there's the norm and then there's outliers. I want to, across anything, the differences between men and women, there's a lot more overlap than there is difference. And this ranges across everything, which really makes it so that whatever we want to identify ourselves as a gender can really, really vary. And does how we think and identify ourselves. Now we have a lot more room to play with that than I think we did when I was a kid. I'll turn it over to you all to fill in the gaps of what I didn't cover.
If you wouldn't mind.
Mhm.
So expanding on this too, the idea that talking about a normal distribution, we actually have something called effect size. So if we're looking at differences between biological men and women, we think that we've got one normal distribution and another normal distribution, and they're just very different. But the reality is there is quite a bit of overlap, and that effect size is looking at sort of the difference between the mean in one group and the mean in another group, and whether or not it's really a small difference or if it's a really big difference. And yes, we do find even when we talk about sex differences in different psychological characteristics or abilities, you really need to take into account that effect size and how much of an overlap there actually is. And another topic I wanted to just hop on as well, the idea that sex has to be binary as well. There is this idea that we have XY for biological male and XX for biological female. And that's it. This doesn't take into account polysomy. So folks who have an XXY or XXX. This also doesn't account for what's called the SRY gene, which includes things like different mutations in how you express maleness or femaleness in terms of sex characteristics, and even something like Swyer syndrome, in which you have what is observably a biological female genitalia, female internal reproductive organs that are slightly atrophied, which is usually how we figure out somebody has the syndrome, but they have an XY chromosome. So someone we would absolutely say, this is a woman, has an XY chromosome. So the idea that we are stuck in this binary and the binary is the default, completely ignores a lot of different folks, just genetically. When we talk about what is male or female in biological sex, but it also applies to gender in that we have a lot of different options there as well. So not just male or female, we can be off the binary completely, thus non-binary. We can have any sort of mix. There's a lot more options that are available, and we kind of want to try to stick with, oh, well, there's a difference between sex and gender in this way, but it turns out sex is pretty non-binary too.
Thank you. Anyone else at the table like to share?
Yeah, I really appreciate both those contexts. I think I just want to try and maybe connect dots over to pronouns, right? Because I think any of us that is prone to wanting to be contemplative, right? It's like the more you think about gender, the more it starts to dissolve in front of you. But at the same time, like Dr. Brent started out by saying, gender is really important to the way that we have structured our society, right? The way we go about our everyday lives. And as a result, it ends up having, for many people, not everyone, right? Because agender is an experience that exists, right? But for most people, there's some strong sense of a connection to the concept of gender in one way or another. And so pronouns, to me, kind of connect to that in terms of, I mean, in many ways, it's like a person's name, right? It's a thing that we don't decide for other people. It's something that, you know, they know for themselves, or maybe their parents tried to decide for them and it stuck or it didn't, right? But it's a reflection of who you are. And I think, if you're familiar with the concept of gaslighting, I think misgendering to me is kind of a form of gaslighting, right? Because you're essentially telling someone that you're not the person you say that you are, that you don't know yourself as well as I know yourself, right? And that can be really destabilizing for people, anyone, right? It's not just about trans folks having that experience. And so, because I think it could be easy to think about, well, if gender is a construct, whatever, like, why does it matter what pronouns I use? Sometimes people will do introductions and say, oh, I don't care what you use, whatever, no big deal, call me it, they, purple, whatever, right? Just kind of making light of it, but ultimately it has impact. I mean, we know even from a research perspective that something like using the chosen name of a trans adolescent significantly decreases their risk of suicide. And the reason for that is because, the risk factors for suicide include things like, a thwarted sense of belongingness, feeling like you're a burden on others, not feeling seen or like you have value. And so it's one of these things that even though it's small and it might seem insignificant, can actually have a really huge impact because it's basically saying to people, I see you, and that's, and it's as simple as that, right? And it might be interesting to imagine a world where gender didn't exist. I'd kind of like to live in that world, right? But we don't, and so the way that we talk and the gendered, how we navigate gendered language really matters.
You were kind of talking about misgendering, which is like the third question, because I literally wrote like, yes, there's research that shows like just using proper pronouns and names reduces, trans youth risk of self-harm and, suicide. And I think there's also an acknowledgement that a large proportion of homeless youth are queer and trans as well. So I think if you are using like proper gender pronouns, honoring and validating their name, you could be like the one adult in their life. And I want to say I've seen like research reference. It shows like if you have like one adult who is willing to like honor you and help you and support you, that can make all of the difference. So when we're also at a university where students are, we have such a high diversity in relation to students of color, first gen students, I'm sure homeless students, like poverty. And so when we know this, like just doing this one thing can mean the difference. And not to be super flippant, but when we talk about the importance of gender and when people say they don't care, misgender someone's dog and they will let you know how important gender is. Or if you misgender their infant, and all babies like look the same. Sorry, that's why we put bows in their hair so we can say what a pretty girl the baby is. And so when people say, why does gender matter? You misgender their dog or their baby, and you will know how much gender also matters to like cisgender folks. Again, not to be super flippant about it, but.
I'll add a very small point here, which is I think it's also important to note when we're talking about why this matters is that there's a growing number of people in the US who are willing to identify themselves as trans, which is not saying that more people now are trans than were ever before, but instead that people are willing, are coming out. Pew from 2022 estimates that 1.6% of all US adults identify as trans or non-binary, and 5.1% of adults aged 18 to 29. So also the age range of folks that we as educators are interacting with are also more likely to have come out and be navigating that experience while in college, while in grad school, and being really conscious of that, I think is also a piece of why this is really important. I also want to echo what Dr. Brents mentioned, which is that this is also not new. Trans folks have existed in history for a very long time, and there are a lot of queer scholars and trans scholars who are doing the work to identify and piece together those histories. So I'll shout out one book in case folks are interested in learning more, which is Black on Both Sides by C. Riley Snorton, who identifies the intersection of Blackness and transness in the US specifically from the mid 1800s to present day. And I think does a really good job of helping us disentangle this idea that this is new when it really isn't. And instead it's time for us to embrace having these conversations and treating folks' pronouns as real things that we all should be contending with and navigating on a daily basis.
Well, thank you all so much. So we started to get into our third question a little bit, but I'm going to put it out there for others to add in. What are some consequences of misgendering?
I'll let others elaborate on this a bit, but I think the point was clear. You want somebody to call you by your wrong name. I mean, it's that, it's your identity, which can be very personal. But importantly, it's not just your identity, it's a whole set of institutional norms, power relationships, et cetera, that are embodied in that. And I'll let everybody else elaborate on this, but I want to say both that we are in a period of transition, and we're not all used to doing this because it's been so powerful, this gender binary, and the best way to see how powerful it is see how hard it is to break out of this she, he kind of way of thinking about other people. And try your best is what I'm going to say. It's like, if you make a mistake, move on. I mean, do better. You learn from mistakes. It's the don't try to do it that I think hurts people the most, or making the mistake over and over and over again. That's problematic.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people fear, is this idea like, oh, if I mess up and everyone's gonna like be mad at me. But I think, and like, I can be vulnerable. Like, I've done it. I've had students who are trans or use a different name than what I see on my roster, and I mess up and I have to make sure to make a note. Or like, I use the wrong name in an email. I've done that before. And then it's just, oh, hey, sorry, I did this. And then you move on, right? And students, like, from my experience, appreciate that it's like, I recognized it, but I'm not going to make a big deal about it, because I also don't want them to be in the position to have to like assuage my guilt, right? Like, that's not, they're not there to make me feel bad. And so I think that's it, is just being like, oh, apologies, and moving on. And if you feel like you are struggling with, like, my mother really struggles with they, them pronouns. And she has said, like, I'm just kind of confused by it. And I'm like, well, let's practice. But like, that's okay too. Why don't you just practice? Hey, I'm going to the doctor's today, or I went to the doctor's. Well, what did they say? Because I didn't say who my doctor was, right? What their gender was. And so I think that's like, come into the conversation with the acknowledgement that folks are doing their best, and no one is there to like attack you if you get it wrong. It's the purposeful doing it wrong over and over.
And I just want to step in a little bit too. The idea here is when we say there's a greater risk of suicide for folks who have constantly been misgendered, we're talking about sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. That it's not just because people are thinking, well, I made a mistake. I'm sorry, I called you the wrong thing. Why is this so connected with something as severe and dramatic as suicide? And the idea is it's usually not just this one thing. It's, again, systemic. It is continuous messaging that this person does not exist, that they have to continuously try to prove that they should have basic human rights and consideration, and it's exhausting. And it may not be that your one instance of misgendering is what leads to this, but again, it's another little cut. And in general, yes, I do want to say and agree with everybody that yes, most folks are very appreciative if you make a mistake and then you correct it. I have had some pushback with folks who are, well, I said sir to somebody and they say it's ma'am, and they were very rude to me about it. And the idea is, well, how many cuts have they endured before yours? So it may have just been the one that was just too much. And when we think about this, again, the idea of not being flippant about it, and again, not a full comparison, but let's say that you go to a coffee shop every day and you're there and they know that you come in every day and you tell them the name to call out for your order and they always mess it up. And they say, oh, okay, and I'll fix it tomorrow, and they just never do, right? At what point are you allowed to be angry about this? And the idea is we do have that threshold. We do have a point, and this is different for everybody. When are you allowed to say something? Like, hey, I've been coming here for like months and you can't even get my name right. Or so there is a point where we're allowed to be angry at this sort of misidentification. And it may just be, and not saying that this is the case, but sometimes if you are interacting with somebody and this comes up and you're wondering why the pushback is so severe, well, they've reached their threshold. So again, for the vast majority, very understanding, you say you've made a mistake and you correct it. But if you get pushback, it is a human reaction to want to be defensive and say, wait a second, my mistake wasn't that big. And why should I have to fix this if you're going to be upset about it or you're going to be really aggressive about it? But keep that in mind that this just may be a person's threshold to where they need to make that response.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said thus far, but wanted to add just a couple thoughts and maybe an example from experience. I would add kind of to that death by a thousand cuts piece that it's, I think, worth noting too, that in a way misgendering is kind of almost like calling someone a slur, right? It's language that you also hear from people who mean you harm, right? You know, when trolls are on the internet, especially trolls with followings, you know, debate your gender in public online spaces, and I can't tell if it's he or she or whatever, right? Like it's similar kinds of like, you know, being kind of cavalier about those things that are associated with real threats to our safety, right? So I think that's worth keeping in mind, even if that's not obviously your intent. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Dr. Brents, is this idea that like there's kind of a beauty in the fact that pronouns, like having, you know, start having these conversations about pronouns and having to be aware of pronouns makes us pause, right? That it's not easy in a way, because I think it serves as a reminder that we can't just assume things about people. So for example, I previously worked for a university, and I remember I was getting my first emails, like probably even before my first day coming in, and I was excited. So I'm like checking my email because why not, right? The only emails that come through are from IT, you know, talking about IT things or tickets, right? Because the only information they had about me, aside from, you know, my computer information, IT stuff, right, was the spelling of my name, right, which is Erin. They called me she all throughout their exchange back and forth. And like, yeah, sure, end of the day, not the end of the world, but it's like, that's the first impression I have of my new place. You know, is this kind of like, and then, you know, either you just try to ignore it because you're like, I don't know if I'll talk to those people, for, you know, again or not, or you have to correct it. But by correcting it, you are outing yourself as trans, right? Or at least as having an unconventionally spelled name, you know? And so it's things like that, right? That can trip things up, and on that kind of systemic level too, right? And so I think it's just a good reminder, right? That you don't know just based on how a person's name is spelled, how they appear to you, you know, what kind of context you hear about them in. It's good for us to take that pause, even if it's hard on our brains a little bit, right? To kind of interrupt that process.
I'll just add a very small thing, which in kind of reacting and thinking about what Dr. Pasinski just shared and thinking about like death by a thousand cuts. I think also those moments when folks do react more offended or upset when being misgendered, if we can train our brains to respond to that by, and this is why I have to do better, rather than getting offended and taking it as a personal offense, I think that is really helpful and like a useful strategy or thing to say in your head when it does happen, especially when thinking that like what harm is coming to someone who is misgender, who is doing the misgendering, and seeing someone get really upset by it compared to the harm that's the one more cut that is the threshold for someone who's been misgendered over and over and over again. So.
Thank you all so much. We do have some questions from the audience. And again, just a reminder, if anyone in the audience has a question, you can write it on your little card and we'll collect it. And those online feel welcome to type it in the chat. But these are some good ones, so here we go. As a TA, I teach undergrads. I try to use appropriate pronouns. If I don't know which to use, what's the best way to ask? I don't want to offend anyone, and how can I correct it in class if I do?
So when I was talking about practicing pronouns and also, so if I don't know, my general working in my classes is I use gender neutral pronouns to just refer to students if I also don't know their names yet. And I understand if you're, so I don't know what you're TAing for. You might have hundreds of students in a gen ed class. But I think like using names, I use they, them to kind of get like a gender neutral, right? And like sometimes students will also just tell me, I think that's also the changing culture, is that students kind of just say it a lot of the times. I don't have students introduce themselves saying it out loud just because I worry about, in my experience, when you have someone who, and excuse the language for this, gender weird, usually what happens when it gets to their turn to maybe say a pronoun, everyone looks at them. But students do tend to just kind of say it themselves, but using their names, if you know it, gender neutral pronouns. I also refer to my students as class colleagues. Like I just say like, oh, like your class colleague said, right? And I can, because I try and have this community of learners. So I think I've just shifted my language to kind of make it so that I'm less likely to make the mistake if I don't know. And I've definitely had lots of trans students, and they've told me that that's the only reason I know, because they've been very open. But those are my kind of tips and tricks is, oh yeah, like your class colleague said, thank you for sharing, because also I'm really bad with names and I'm doing my best. But that's one way that I have handled those situations.
You walk a line. You walk a line between you don't want to intentionally, you don't want to out somebody, you don't want to put somebody on the spot. And so that's a great way to do that. Also, you don't want to ask what's your preferred pronoun, because that's like asking what's your preferred name, what's your preferred, it's like, what is your pronoun? That would be a way to ask generally in a one-on-one basis. You wouldn't, hey, everybody who goes by this pronoun, raise your hand. You don't want to do that.
I've had students, I've had a number of students who I've written letters of recommendation for. And I realize that I use gendered pronouns when talking about them. And I have had to step back and say, hey, just so I'm being respectful, what pronouns would you like me to use in your letter? And that can be, and again, this can be one-on-one via email. Hey, just to make sure I'm using the right ones, what pronouns would you like me to use? And another thing that I do that you all can do really easy, because I made it into a course commons, is that I include a introduction letter. So I have an optional sort of identification letter. And this allows students, and not just for trans reasons, there are different cultural reasons. You might find that a student is like, none of my professors can pronounce my name right, so I'm going to go by a anglicized version of my name. Or, hey, I prefer to go by my middle name, right? So this helps not only trans students, but a lot of other students too. And as we will see, intersectionality is very important. And when you make these sort of accommodations for trans students, it helps a lot of other students who may be cis as well. But the idea is I give them a little template, and before classes start, they can copy and paste that template and say, hey, my name is so-and-so. It might show up in your roster as this. But this is what I would, this was what I would want going forward. It includes pronouns, and they can include whatever it is that they would like. It also includes instructions on how they can change their display name in Web Campus as well. And what I have found is the earlier you address this, the less likely you're going to have problems later in the semester. So if somebody decides to give you this information to begin with, you are prepared coming in. So you don't have to stop and go, well, wait a second, what should I use with you? Because hopefully that student has conveyed that information before the class has even started.
I have a quick question. That is a letter that just goes to you. That's not shared among classes.
Yeah, it goes to me. The class commons is the template for it. So you can just, and I need to update it because it still uses webcam or WebEx instead of Zoom. I have an updated version for it, so I'll put it up there. But the idea is you can just import that into a Canvas course, and you'll get connected to your students, and it'll show your students that you care about this. So even if they do not feel comfortable sharing this information with you, this is one more step to show that you are somebody who is safe, that they can disclose this information to.
I'll add to this because I do a similar thing, but for folks who may be less adept in Canvas, I send a Google form out to my students at the beginning of every semester, asking a variety of questions, also just about like previous experience with this kinds of content, like basic instructor things that you might want to know, but similarly ask like name on roster, name that you want to be called, and then gender pronouns if they're willing to share them. I want to make the note of like, I would caution to never require that students disclose their pronouns, especially given our current political climate. Yeah, like also being conscious and cognizant of what we're requiring students to tell us about themselves. So.
Thank you all. I think this is a good kind of segue into another question from the audience about what resources are available for students at UNLV who may be struggling with their gender. What more could be done, and or does UNLV have an LGBTQIA+ center?
So just really quick, I saw it on UNLV Today, those emails we always get. Dr. Biazzo in the health center started like a transgender health, like specific team, it seems like. It was a couple months ago, that's why I'm kind of blanking, but it does look like, at least in relationship to healthcare, that the UNLV Health Center has like a dedicated team who is trying to, you know, reach out and help and offer like gender affirmative care. Thank you. Oh my gosh. So yeah, so just that's one resource that is here.
I guess I can add a little bit to that. Yes, thank you for that, for shouting out the gender care team at the health clinic. For students that want to access that service, you basically just sign up like you would any other appointment, except you select the option for gender care. They currently have an interesting survey that I'm still deciding how I feel about, but we'll ask you a number of questions when you sign up for that, so just anticipate that. I think they're asking for good reasons. Otherwise, I'm a fairly new student, but maybe this is a fair way to tell what I know about and what should I know about. But we do have a graduate student club for LGBTQ students meeting later tonight, this afternoon. I believe there's an undergrad kind of equivalent to that, maybe called Spectrum. I'm not sure, don't quote me. There, I believe also CAPS offers like an LGBTQ support group. So there are a handful of things. I do think that there, personally, I feel like there could be maybe a little more support or opportunities for connection for trans students, as well as kind of like advocacy around what folks need on campus. So I'm glad we're having these kind of conversations. Hope we keep having them because I do think there's a need for a little bit more there, but I don't know kind of on the staffing side and the student diversity programs, I don't really know exactly what lives in that realm, so I can't speak to it.
So I included them in the chat, but the listing for the Involvement Center for Spectrum. And also we do have a resource page on the UNLV website that includes queer people of color meetups. There is specific financial aid nights, Lavender graduation, ACE week, trans at UNLV, including resources to make sure that your display names are proper. for Web Campus and so forth. So one of the first on-campus resources is also about pronouns. So we definitely do have a fair list of them. Hopefully, if you can see the chat, they are listed there. And I don't know if we can have a reference, a resource list afterwards to send out to folks, but that could be a possibility too.
I know specifically about campus, but I did just want to shout out like the LGBTQ Center of Southern Nevada. It's down Maryland. Like I said, I used to volunteer there. I volunteered in the health clinic part where they do STI testing and things like that. But I know they have a lot of events. I have a friend who was running an asexual support group. So it bus ride, maybe a little bit of a drive, but that is also an option.
Thank you all so much. And yeah, we're definitely happy to share resources that you provide with those who attended today and students in general in our programs. We have a lot of questions, so apologize if we probably are not likely to get to all of them. But I'm gonna try a few more here before we wrap up. So for people raised in a culture of ma'am and sir, or even the military community in which sir and ma'am are a requirement, how would you recommend they navigate identifying with they, them pronouns in that formal way?
I would also like to have an answer to this, only because that is like the one thing I've yet to find a gender neutral way to talk about it. Because I've even seen like niece and nephew, you can say like nibbling, so like sibling, but it's your nibbling, as like a gender neutral way of talking about your siblings' young children. Siblings, a gender neutral way of talking about a relative parent, but ma'am and sir is really the one that's been difficult for me. I know with instead of like Mr. and Mrs., there's like mix. So there are ways to have formal titles that aren't gendered. But as we're talking about gender evolves, so does language. So if anyone wants to coin a really good one, but I'm going to be honest, that's been the one that's hard for me, and I find myself mamming and sirring to folks. But one of the conferences I go to, for example, for some reason requires that we put things like Mr. and Mrs., but they have a mix option. So MX is what that looks like. So yeah, that's one way to use formal titles if you know like the person's last name at least, because I do understand, especially talking about a military background, the formalities and how that would be challenging.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo real quick that that's also one I've not come across a specific gender kind of neutral option for, but I think for me on a practical level, I mean, the military is its own context. I can't address that issue really, but I think about what am I trying to convey in this context that feels important, you know, so if you like, in a retail environment, right, maybe someone left and their phone's still on the counter or something, right? Normally we might think, oh, ma'am, sir, you know, try to get their attention, right? Like friend, you know, I don't know, like you just got to kind of get creative about like, what are you trying to convey, right? Because I think in these contexts, it's often about respect for authority or elder status, right? And so you kind of have to situationally address it. But I will say there are many contexts in which ma'am and sir are really, truly not necessary, like call centers. You do not need to call me ma'am or sir, especially because you're mostly going to call me ma'am. So please just don't, right? Like it's not helpful. Like it is it's much more disrespectful, I think. I'm biased, I suppose, but to call someone the wrong one than to just not use those terms, right? And so I think, yeah, just being aware of the context can go a long way.
One of the things that I do enjoy is that both doctor and professor are gender neutral. But yes, this is very, very difficult. Again, part of my family is from the South, and it is very common to get Miss Amanda, and it is very difficult, especially in calls for healthcare reasons or anything else. Okay, Miss Amanda. Mix is an option. Again, it may not be as widely used, but there are ways I would feel it is a little bit easier just to start moving back from that. And the content of the message is going to be a lot more important than the signifier or title that you're going to use.
Thank you all. Okay, another question from our audience. What recommendations would you have for responding to someone who says that they're unwilling to honor these differences because it's just too hard to get it right? Tough one.
First, I think it's going to depend on your relationship with the person and what kind of relationship you are wanting to have with that person. Like I said, many homeless youth are queer and trans because they have been kicked out of their homes. There's a certain concept called found family in queer communities because blood relation, like, and I know we have, you know, we want to be connected to those we are biologically related to. And so if you want to fight the good fight and do that, but I think there would come a point where maybe your own like mental health in that situation might need to take precedent if someone is really truly unwilling. Because I come across contexts where folks are like, well, just show me the data. Why does it matter? And you do, and it doesn't matter. Right. But then you try and give them a more emotional response, and then you're just being emotional and biased. And I think it is really choosing the battles you want to have. And I have lots of friends who don't speak to their families anymore. So like I said, if it's someone on the street, like at the end of the day, my safety might be more important than having a big argument with them. But if it's my father, maybe I will try a little harder to like have these conversations. But I do think we put a lot of emphasis on our relationships, and I don't want to downplay those, but it depends on how much you want to be willing to have that person in your life if they're willing to do harm.
I would just say if it's in a course context and you're an instructor, you can put, like I frequently do, put at the beginning of my syllabus that like hate speech and disrespect toward peers will not be accepted. And then I also try to do what other folks have talked about of like using gender neutral language whenever referring to other students to model how that can be done easily so that it doesn't matter what you believe on this thing, you can still navigate this course without like, misgendering and deeply hurting someone else in the class, which also does not make for a good course context. So.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things I would add. One, I think if it's not on the flip side of kind of relational spectrum, you know, we're talking about close family and sometimes you have to walk away from that. On the other end of like people on the internet, I think sometimes you could try to be more in relationship with if you are wanting to engage in those things, right? And I think something that I found helpful as someone who's somewhat conflict averse but cares about social justice, and I can send it out later, is tools for interrupting oppression from the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. But what I like about it is that it recognizes people have different personalities and ways of responding to troubling things that are coming out of other people's mouths, right? And so among those approaches are humor, right? Like you can use humor to be like, whoa, what was that about? You know, like you can also ask questions. I love to ask questions like, or tell me more about that. Like, what does that mean to you? You know, depending on the right? Sometimes you know what it means to them and you really don't want to hear what it means beyond what they've already said. So just realizing there's different approaches you could take, right? You can also, you don't, you know, ideally, yes, you address things in the moment, but just because you've missed the moment doesn't mean you can't revisit it, right? You know, I've had a lot of success with kind of the approach of saying, hey, you know, I wanted to talk to you about that thing you said the other day. I know it's important to you that you treat people with respect. And so that's why I'm bringing this up. And then just kind of explain the situation. The other thing I wanted to say is I think just kind of reminding people about the relationship and difference between intent and impact. I think we have a tendency to think, well, because I didn't mean any harm, you know, like I can't be bothered to figure it out, but I'm not hateful, you know. That's great, better than an ill intent. But at the end of the day, what matters is the impact that it has on people, right? And hopefully most people who are not, you know, psychopaths or sociopaths or whatnot, right? Like will care how they impact other people, right? And so I think appealing to that kind of whatever shared values you might have with that person, so kind of they're better angels instead of instead of attacking the things that you find negative is, I think, helpful.
Thank you. So we have just about 5 minutes left. I want to be sure to ask one of these questions, but feel free to interject any last minute words that you really want us to know as well. But what are some suggestions that you might have for how faculty, staff, and students at UNLV can contribute to creating a more supportive and inclusive environment for students of diverse gender identities and expressions?
Notice and care. I mean, see people. I'll start there and let you all be specific.
Well, I was gonna say we have already so many resources. Now I'm gonna be looking at the comments to look at Dr. Pasinski's, letter. We're thinking about, I do like the note cards because I'm usually teaching in person. So I'll say, tell me something about you that'll help me support you. And students will sometimes say nothing, or they say like, I struggle with time management, or please use my proper gender pronoun. So I'm already signaling that I want to know how to support them. I think depending on what you're teaching, I teach sociology, and I teach sociology of the body. So I'm trying to bring in, diverse authors. Like, it's not just people writing about trans experience. I'm trying to bring in trans authors talking about their gender experience. But so even just diversifying your content. I've assigned memoirs before, right? So even more personal types of works. So I think, but there are ways to just signal in the beginning that you're here for their success and support.
Just like a couple quick high points I would add. Share your own pronouns, right? That's important. Otherwise, it can feel hypocritical, or you end up being the only person in the meeting who shares your own pronouns, and that's always a little awkward. I think being aware of the impact of world and current events on your students and colleagues, right? Recognizing that, when there's a violent transphobic attack, even if it happens in Oklahoma, that's going to impact the people that you are interacting with. And I would say, particularly if it's a colleague, sometimes not acknowledging it makes it even worse, right? Because it's like, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen. Okay, cool. I think the other thing is, looking at your course content, especially if you're in like the sciences or something that might have this kind of very binary framing for sex and gender, because you don't want your students to look through the course content and feel like, wow, I'm paying to learn about things about me that are not even true or harmful in some way. And these things, they change, right? We get up on them all the time, but just be mindful of that, or the language that you use in your courses, or the way you talk about disaggregation of data. I would say the other thing too is practice saying things out loud. Because sometimes, I feel like I feel the good vibes and good intentions coming off someone, but they are really having a hard time saying LGBTQ. And it's like, it's cool just to say it more times, right? Just get comfortable with it. Like, I could tell you care, but also it's a little awkward, right? So get comfy with stuff.
I have a super, super quick one, just speaking of the sciences, is that, for example, in sociology, right, we do quantitative, we do statistics, we do surveys, and a lot of what we practice on is the general social survey, right? And a lot of times the gender, which is already wrong, and then it says or it says sex, man and woman, or gender, female and male, which is already incorrect, right? Talking about gender expression versus sex. But when I've talked to students about that, I openly acknowledge, look, this is the tool we're using to practice writing a survey, to practice reading data, to practice SPSS, but I'm going to say that this is limited, right? In relationship to the human experience. Okay, so even if it's a tool I'm using to teach, I can still just easily be like, and we know as sociologists that this is not necessarily true. So just speaking of from a science perspective that's looking at binary, right? I can easily just at least signal that we know this.
Yep. Come up with operational definitions. That's a big thing. It's a big thing in science, right? And addressing things as they come up, providing context is always important. Again, saying okay, we're going to talk about male and female. When I say male here, I'm meaning biological male. address the limitations in what you're talking about there. Again, context is really, really important. The more information that you can provide, the better. It's essentially visibility. So providing, so being visible in terms of, here are my pronouns, even if you are cisgendered, including different resources, making it visible, again, showing that you care about these things, that it's important to you, that it's important to you to get it right. And again, it's just making this visible has a lot of really, really positive benefits.
All right, well, thank you. So as we wrap up here, apologies for the questions we did not get to. Maybe we'll have a part 2 one of these days. I just want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise, also your time today. Thank you so very much for being here. Let's maybe do a little round of applause. And thank you to everyone who came as well and those online. Last note, we are going to drop a survey in the chat. Please complete the survey if you can. It helps us inform future workshops. And I'm going to bring a QR code up on the screen in a sec here as well. But thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.